Hello everyone, I'm Walter Poleman from the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. And today we are out at Waterbury Reservoir, a gorgeous spot that many people come to go paddling and hiking right on the edge of Little River State Park in the town of Waterbury. It's just a beautiful morning in late October here. Clouds are low, loons are swimming around. Although the foliage is past peak, it's just a fantastic day to be here. And I'm here with my colleague Chris Brooks, also from the University of Vermont, and we're going to be exploring the landscape sort of in and around Waterbury Reservoir. I partly say in because actually there's a farming community that thrived here during the 19th century. Some of it is now covered by the reservoir, but a lot of it is exposed up on the hillside in the area that is now occupied by Little River State Park. So thanks for joining us. I wanted to say just a little bit about this place, partly because you can almost do some time traveling here in some ways, because the reservoir here is at about 600 feet above present-day sea level, or 500 feet above Lake Champlain. The Little River, which was dammed to make this reservoir, ultimately flows into the Winooski River, and then the Winooski River, of course, flows out into Lake Champlain. We'll hear more about why it was built from Chris in a minute, but I did want to say, if you think back into deep geologic time, there was actually a glacial lake that filled this valley at almost exactly the same elevation. If you look on a surficial geology map, you can see that Glacial Lake, Vermont, that was dammed by the melting ice as the glacier retreated in the Champlain Valley, backed up water all the way to this elevation. And I like to think this is what the landscape might look like in terms of at least the topography and the level of the water back about 12,000 years ago. So it's pretty cool from that perspective. Water is really a theme of this place, and we're here, it's now 2020 in October, but 93 years ago, October of 1927, it was a very rainy fall, and it led to, really culminated in what was called the Big Flood of 1927. And I have a little story from that. I just want to read you a little bit about this, the flood of 1927. It had been a wet fall, with October rains running 150% above normal. The ground was saturated. Even a storm of average intensity would have caused flooding. But this was no average storm. In the late morning and afternoon of November 3rd, 1927, all Vermont rainfall records were broken, with up to 10 inches of rain falling in some parts of the state. David Lublin's Vermont Weather Book says, "It was as if a cubic mile of solid water had been lifted from the surface of the Atlantic Ocean and deposited on the hills and valleys of the Green Mountain State. 84 people died, including the Lieutenant Governor, S. Hollister Jackson. More than 1,000 bridges were destroyed, and 10,000 people were left homeless." Needless to say, this was a very significant event in the lives of Vermonters during the 20th century, and we still feel its legacy today. Some of it has to do with the whole reason that this reservoir is here. And of course, since then, we have had some major floods like Hurricane Irene, which was a tropical storm by the time it reached Vermont. But some people think that these flood control reservoirs actually made a difference in lessening the devastation that happened most recently. Of course, this reservoir is formed by the dam itself. And my colleague Chris Brooks is up there right now. So let's go join him and learn a little bit more about the history of this place.
So I'm up here on Waterbury Dam, looking out over the Waterbury Reservoir. This dam was built in the 1930s, and it was a part of a series of New Deal projects around that time, where the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, working in conjunction with the United States Army Corps of Engineers, built a series of flood control dams here in Vermont and really all over the country at that time. And so the primary impetus for building this dam was really all about flood control. And as Walt mentioned, there were a series of really devastating floods in Vermont in the early part of the 20th century, and that was really caused primarily by land use practices that dated back to the 19th century. So During the bulk of the 19th century, deforestation was happening in Vermont. Probably sometime around the middle 19th century, say from 1850 to 1870, at the height of land clearance, as much as 70% of the forests here were cleared. And so the result of that land use was increasing erosion, decreasing soil fertility, increasing sedimentation in rivers and streams and degraded water quality, and increasing flood events, increasing flood damages. So the primary impetus of the dam was flood control. We knew that Vermonters knew that they needed to take some steps to protect property from flood damages. Also, around that time in the early part of the 20th century, there was an increasing recognition among Vermonters about the effects of deforestation and an understanding that a lot of this land that had been cleared needed to be returned to forest in order to protect water resources and protect property. Later on in the life of this dam, it was converted for hydropower. So at the base of the dam now is the Little River Hydro Station, which generates as much as 5.5 megawatts of power. And really, the most important use of this place today is as a source of drinking water and as a place for recreation. It's a rather large reservoir, about 860 acres of surface water area. It's about 100 feet deep at its maximum depth, and it's surrounded by just amazing hiking trails. The Mount Mansfield State Forest surrounds this reservoir, and there's actually 2 state parks on either side of the reservoir, the Little River State Park and the Waterbury Center State Park. So it's a great place for hiking, for paddling. We just saw a couple of loons out here, so you can see loons and herons and eagles and hawks. It's really a great spot. More generally, it's an amazing place and a really interesting place to study social ecological systems, how natural systems and social systems interact. So we've driven up just a couple of miles from the Waterbury Dam, and we're now in Little River State Park. Even though this is a forested area today, in the 19th century this land was largely cleared, and there were a series of settlements and hill farms here. So hiking through the woods today, we can still find evidence of past land use and these hill farms that existed here. So now Walt and I are going to head up the trail, and we're going to start right here in the middle of the state park, and we're going to hike up to the hill farm, and then we're going to eventually make our way up to Gideon Rickard's farm, what they call the history hike here at Little River State Park.
Oh, I'm psyched to be going up here, Chris. I first came to this site back in 1994, I remember, and I had a chance to visit all these historic farmsteads that just looked like forest to me at the time.
Right.
But when you look closely, you can start seeing the clues of human imprint on the place through time. It's a great spot for reading the forested landscape.
It's really interesting to try to visualize what it would have looked like here in the middle of the 19th century. So we're just a little ways up the history hike here, and we're now at the site of the David Hill Farm. This farm was developed sometime in the middle of the 1820s, and there's really not a lot to see here, at least from the untrained eye. Right here, there's remnants of an old stone wall, and one of the cool features here is that there's also daylilies that are still here, dating all the way back, presumably, to when this was a working farmstead. But you can look across this area and start to pick out more evidence of this farmstead and what life would have been like here. So we're going to ask Walt to help us interpret what we see.
The David Hill Farm at this first part of the history hike is really a great spot to practice doing some detective work where we try to read the forested landscape. And the clues generally fall into 2 main categories. One of them is the vegetation of a site, both the composition and then the structure of the forest that's growing up. So that's a big part of it. The other thing is actually physical features on the landscape that have endured through time, and particularly stoneworks. And here we are at a spot, it might just look like a hole in the ground right here, but if you look carefully at this area, the size and the shape of it, it's a rectangular hole in the ground, essentially. And if you look around the sides, below all these leaves and things that are rotting here, you can start to see that there's actually a large pile of rocks right here. Stones that are of all kind of the same size. And then if you went along the edge of this, you could see the old stoneworks, which were really the foundation of a building. And this was an early settler cabin. I think the David Hill Farm represents one of the early sites in the 1820s. We know it's been abandoned for a long time because of this beautiful yellow birch that's growing right out of the foundation. Actually, the earliest settlers, they didn't even bother to dig holes and foundations for their cabins. They just kind of built them at the surface. But when farming really started to take hold, and these were subsistence farms, people needed a place to store essentially root crops and things over the winter time. And so the foundation of the house went down 4 to 6 feet below the frost line, and it would serve as a place not only to store food items, but it also provided a foundation for the house which would sit right on top. And so it was important to be down below that frost-free zone where it was not freezing, but it was very cool. And as we look at several of these, this is probably the most subtle one, but as we head up into the forest and we look at the other homesteads, we'll be able to see the structure much more intact. This one is crumbled quite a bit, but I do notice that there is a pile of stones right here, and this is very likely where the chimney was, the foundation for the chimney that has collapsed through time, went up through the center of the house, and then the rooms were on either side. And the front door, of course, opened up to here to where the road is. So you look at the stonework, but then you look at the vegetation associated with the stonework, and I can already see right here on the corner, even though it's October, the bright green foliage of a non-native species here is honeysuckle. That somebody, one of the inhabitants of this house, the family that was here, planted to beautify the house as it looked out onto the roadway here. So honeysuckles and daylilies are an example of that. And then I think over here, they actually had some lilacs planted. All right, well, hopefully we can find this lilac. It was here last time. I think I do see some remnants. Yeah, sure enough. All right, well, we found a lilac here, and this is just another great example of people beautifying their landscape where their house was, just like we all do in our neighborhoods and around our homes. Lilacs and honeysuckles are just incredible because they're woody plants and they can persist for a long time. And I think people plant lilacs because they bloom right around Mother's Day in that beautiful sort of light bluish purple foliage. And they're just an example of a sign that people once lived here and cared about this place. And hopefully that'll continue to persist for a while. And I think of this together with apple trees and a butternut tree that I could see down over there. Those, of course, are used for food and cider making, but the lilac really had no other purpose other than to make it more beautiful. If you don't mind, I've got a little song about this site written by Kate Wolf that's all about a lilac talking to an apple tree on a site just like this. A lilac bush and an apple tree were standing in the woods, all up on a hill above the town where once a farmhouse stood. In the winter the trees are bare and no one sees the sign of a house that stood and a garden that grew, a life in another time. One spring when the buds came bursting forth and grass grew on the land, the lilac spoke to the apple tree as only an old friend can. Do you think, said the lilac, this might be the year when someone will build here once more? Here by the cellar, still open and deep, there's room for new walls and a floor. Oh no, said the apple, there are so few who come here on the mountain this way, and when they do, they don't often see why we're growing here so far away. A long time ago we were planted by hands that worked in the mines and the hills, when the country was young and the people who came built their homes in the hills. Oh, now there are cities, the roads have come, and no one lives here today. And the only sign of the farms in the hills are the things not carried away. Broken dishes, piles of boards, a tin plate, an old leather shoe, and an apple tree still bending down, and a lilac where a garden once grew.
So we're sort of bushwhacking our way uphill from David Hill's farm to Gideon Rickard's farm. And Walt, I know that there was an old farm road here at some point. Can you help us interpret where that road would have been and what signs on the landscape can point that out to us today?
Well, I think you're right in the middle of it, Chris. There's some evidence. First of all, the deepening sort of rut going up this hillside where there's no stream is a sign that this was an area that was being used. Of course, the vegetation is what's really leaping out at me. Most of this forest it's on its way to maturing in terms of a northern hardwood forest. I see lots of sugar maple, beech, occasional ash tree and hemlock, and even red spruce in here that's starting to come in. But what stands out are these big paper birches, beautiful big paper birches reaching all the way up into the canopy. And if you look at where they are growing, they're growing right out. Boy, there's a whole string of them looking up that way. I could see 5 or 6 or 7 that are growing right on the edges of this road. As we think about the natural history of birches, we know they have some requirements. You know, one of them is they need lots of light. So it would make sense that these got established as this landscape was being abandoned. They also, their seeds, in order to germinate, they're very small. They require exposed mineral soil to do that. And road ruts are kind of the ideal conditions for birch to get established. So we should follow this up and see if we can trace the road by looking at the birches.
We're coming up on a really cool old stone wall here, Walt.
Oh, that looks excellent.
Look at it. It's still a strange thing for me to see. Like, why is there this stone wall in the middle of the woods?
Yeah. Boy, this is a beauty. I mean, compared to the crumbling foundation at the David Hill site, this one still has a lot of integrity to it. Although I have to say it's probably equally old. I know when you're teaching about the different economic farming eras, you teach a lot about the sheep eras, and this is pretty much contemporary with what's the sheep era in Vermont, which really, you know, is like 1820 to 1850, from what I understand, had its real heyday then. And these stone walls are a testament to a couple of things. First of all, the building material itself, stone, it was really important because by that time pretty much the trees had been removed and they couldn't build those zigzagging stacked fences that they'd done earlier, that the early settlers had done. And so they used the material that was available, and that's the glacial till that mantles these hillsides that the soils are forming in. And through freeze-thaw action, stones just kept rising up through the soil level each winter and spring. And they would largely harvest these and concentrate them into these incredible stone features. Thousands of miles of these run through the hills of New England. And just like this, you can encounter them. And I'm just amazed. You know, some people really say that partly because there's more stones in these walls than they are in the pyramids of Egypt, that this should really be considered the 8th wonder of the world.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
And it's a testament to land use history, even though we're in this forest.
Yeah, it makes sense from a land use perspective that after you've cleared all of the forest, and this land here isn't particularly susceptible to being used as cultivated croplands, but it is susceptible to grazing. So it makes sense that there was that transition from deforestation and extracting timber to grazing sheep on the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And economically, sheep made sense at that time because merino sheep had sort of been discovered as something that could bring a lot of money to farms. And so the land went quickly from 40% cleared to 80% cleared in that period of time. Still building these, having built some walls in my day, this is a lot of work, and it's in remarkably good shape. And oftentimes you can actually see the art of the builder or of the group of builders who were doing it. Sometimes you can pick out, who worked on a particular wall section. And it was laborious. From the records I've read, one day's work, if you were lucky, you could build 10 to 20 feet of wall. And so imagine essentially the hundreds of miles of this that go through the forest. Tremendous amount of work. I'm sure oxen were involved as well. But what's kind of cool too is that you can look at the architecture of the wall itself and tell whether it was being built as essentially a pasture boundary or an area that you were trying to keep animals out of so they wouldn't feed on crops and garden plants that were growing, or if it was actually something that they were clearing the land, removing the stones, and creating an area for cultivation. And oftentimes you can tell if the center of the wall actually has lots of small stones in the middle of it that were thrown in there because they needed a place to put them off the land. And so this one to me doesn't look like that. It looks like this was a sheep pasture boundary of some kind in which they were trying to keep animals out or animals in, one way or the other. And this one is standing really well still, formed out of all this glacial till of the local landscape. This is essentially the schist in the Green Mountains. It is the main constituency of this rock. Occasionally you'll find a piece of granite tucked in there that was carried here by the glacier, but most of this is the Underhill Formation, likely. Really cool.
So we've made our way up here to the Gideon Ricker farm. And so whereas the David Hill farm was relatively obscured here in the woods, you can tell that this is clearly a visible site of an old farmstead. And Walt, I'm not quite as bold as you are in terms of the singing, but I think this might be an appropriate time to read a little bit of a poem. This is by Robert Frost, who no doubt himself spent a lot of time in the Vermont woods and likely would have come across ruins of old hill farms while he was here. I'm just going to read a segment of this, and this poem is called Directive. Back out of all this now, too much for us. Back in a time made simple by the loss of detail, burned, dissolved, and broken off. Like graveyard marble sculpture in the weather. There is a house that is no more a house. Upon a farm that is no more a farm, and in a town that is no more a town. The road there, if you'll let a guide direct you, who only has at heart your getting lost. I love those lines, back out of all of this now, back in a time made simple. When you walk upon a site like this, it can kind of make you think of what life might have been like, and at first impression you think of a really simple farmstead life, but in fact life on a hill farm in Ricker Basin was extremely challenging and hard, and these people led really complex lives. So Walt, I wonder if you can help lead us around this site and sort of interpret what life was like here at Gideon Ricker Farm.
Yeah, Chris, well, some of the interpretation here has been done by the folks at Little River State Park. Just some subtle signage here. It doesn't give everything away, but it invites people to explore by giving some context. And indeed, we're on Gideon Ricker Farm. This was the largest and probably most successful of the farms here in the settlement. And we know that partly by the size of the foundation that's here. This was a rather large house. And in fact, when you look at the interpretive signage, you can see the house that sat on that foundation. It was probably a Sunday. I see all these little kids in their Sunday best. It might have been an event like a wedding, could have been a funeral, but it shows this rather large house with two chimneys that was right here and the landscape behind. Gideon Ricker, and we're going to see his grave site in a little while, just up the hill. He and his family came from Maine in 1839. They bought this farm for $1,500, and they really set up a farmstead here that had everything from apple orchards to a pretty large-scale sugaring operation and certainly a dairy operation. In fact, as you stand right here, this is a really cool perspective from where you're looking, Chris. You can be looking at that stone wall in the distance and then be seeing on this interpretive sign, they've set it up in a perfect spot because I can see that wall there is that wall. Of course, these people that are coming maybe down for dinner can imagine them walking down the hill. And then in the background, there is a massive barn in that picture. In a few minutes, let's go check that out and see if we can find the remnants of that barn and, of course, the open landscape that surrounds it. But right here around the foundation, there's lots of details to look at. Boy, this is a different kind of rock. This is not rock that was just gathered as glacial till. In fact, I can see the drill marks in here for when this rock was cut from a stone quarry that they used as part of the foundation. But what's really fascinating, not only do you have these drill marks, but you have these drip marks. You can see where the eaves of the roof probably hung down right up here and water was dripping off there and leaving their mark of rainfalls from, boy, could be 150 years ago. We know that this place was occupied really between the 1840 and into the 1925 or so before the place was bought out. What do you got over there, Chris?
Yeah, there's a bunch of old farm implements over here. This looks like an old aerator here and just a bunch of old tools probably left over from the dairy operation, I'm guessing. Also a bunch of old weathered glass that people have collected around the farmstead and just piled up here. Some of this glass probably dates back to the time when Gideon Ricker was living here.
This is the high drive up to into the barn right here, and then there's a silo foundation over there. All right, we've come up the hill from the house and we're really in the barnyard now. We don't see a barn here, but of course the folks at the park have put up an interpretive sign that shows the Gideon Ricker barn. It was a big barn. In fact, I'm looking at the foundation over here and it had an 84-foot spruce ridgepole that was a log cut from Ricker Mountain, which is right behind me. And that was used in the construction. And of course, it's built out of some incredible stones that were built into a wall, including the ramp that went up to the high drive to store the hay above the stanchions below where the cows were feeding and being milked. And if you look over this direction, actually there's a foundation of a silo. See that big circular area about 12 feet in diameter? This is where the grain was stored, of course, to feed the cows. So barn foundation, silo foundation, and then just the vegetation, which is really young, which shows that this farm was abandoned really back in the 20th century and not before that, because we see a lot of birch trees here as well, all mixed in. As we radiate out from the homestead itself and the barnyard, we get into the further reaches of the farm where both the pastures and the woodlot and the sugar bush, of course, was important on this farm.
So we've hiked up just a little ways uphill, up the old farm road from the Ricker family farmhouse and the barn. And this is the Ricker family burial plot. This is the old cemetery. You can find old cemeteries like this throughout the forests in Vermont. They're very common. If you look at this plot from the old road, you can tell that it looks like it's been built up. And our sort of hypothesis is that Gideon Ricker Sr., in identifying this spot, must have backfilled sand and soil to make it suitable for a burial plot, because the soil here is so rocky it would have been really hard to find a suitable spot for a cemetery. Another interesting thing that you'll see here is that the cemetery is surrounded by these northern white cedars, which otherwise would be relatively uncommon in these woods, but they were typically planted for symbolic reasons. Northern white cedars, otherwise known as arbor vitae, the tree of life. symbolically giving eternal life to the family members who were buried here.
It's really interesting though, because you come back in here, look at the topography in here. Do you see all the hummocks? Yeah, and to me, it's very different than across the way, that this was never cleared. We've come up the hill just a little ways from the Gideon family cemetery, and we're here in one of the more fascinating spots in the landscape of the Gideon Ricker farm, and that is the sugar bush. Most farms in Vermont of this era tapped sugar maples in order to obviously derive the sap to create maple syrup and maple sugar, and it was a big part of this farm. In fact, as you look at this landscape, there's a couple of striking features. One of them is these massive sugar maples that still hold the site. We often refer to them as monarch maples. If you come across a site with really big old maples that dominate the landscape, as this forest does, I see 10, 20, 30 big sugar maples right behind us here. It's a sign that people were spending a lot of time in this sugar bush, probably in the March of every year. And traditionally, the maple season really began right at town meeting day, the first Tuesday in March. There's stories actually of the person who bought the farm from the Ricker family, Herbert Pike, who really owned this farm until pretty much they sold out to the power company that was acquiring the land here to eventually build a reservoir. Stories of Herbert Pike driving his oxen from tree to empty the filling sugar buckets, calling out and yelling so loudly that his fiancée could hear him down in the Moscow Valley as he told his oxen what to do. So he was quite a character, Herbert Pike. One of the things I really love about this site, when you think about it being settled and initial farmers laying out the farmscape, where were they going to have the sugar bush? Obviously, they'd look for a place there was a concentration of sugar maples to begin with. And I think this site had it. In fact, we've done some soil investigation. The soils are a little bit richer here, therefore the sugar maples are bigger and more productive. But what's really striking is the substrate here has a tremendous amount of hummocky topography that ecologists call pit and mound topography, pillow and cradle. And it usually comes from really old forests where trees fall down and their roots rip out the soil and create both a depression and a pile next to it, or a pillow and a cradle. This forest really manifests that. So my hypothesis is that this forest was never cleared of trees, even during these early farming eras, because it was established as a spot where they were going to tap sugar maples. And it manifests that still in what we almost call old growth substrate, looking here. These trees are aging and they're getting near the end of their life. But what's pretty cool is that in the forested area here below, which was likely an open pasture, there are just all these young sugar maples coming up because the seed rain of these big monarch maples was carried down into this open field. And when it was abandoned agriculturally, a maple forest grew back. Let's go see if we can find the site where the sugar house would have been. We're getting close here. I love that stone wall. Central to the success of any sugar bush, of course, is the sugar house itself. That's the place where the farmer would be gathering and concentrating the buckets of sap that have been gathered throughout the sugar bush, bringing them down here to be evaporated and ultimately turned into syrup and possibly into sugar. And we are in really the remnants of the Gideon sugar house right here. And we can tell a little bit by looking. First of all, it's got a stone wall sort of around it, which makes it, obviously there was a structure here at one point. And then if you look at a little bit more closely, you can start to see some sort of artifacts, like there's a bunch of bricks here as well. And of course, building a fire is critical in order to evaporate the sap. And so a brick arch was built that would hold the evaporated pan on top, and you'd build a fire underneath. And so bricks were a key part of that. And we can see lots of bricks here that are remnants of the fact that the sugar house was here. And looking around, you can often find pieces of the evaporator itself. It had to be thin metal so that you could heat it from below and the sap would start to boil and become more and more concentrated. So that's pretty neat. We've got the arch, we've got the evaporator pan, we've got some old buckets here that were likely involved in collecting sap and bringing them in. Sometimes you can find actual metal piping that was used to bring the sap from a holding barrel into the sugar house itself. So it's really cool here, the remnants that you can find that's just downhill from the sugar bush itself. And thinking about this particular sugar bush, why they selected this area, part of it probably has to do with the soils and the fact that sugar maple was already abundant here. So we're seeing lots of sugar maple leaves and significantly a lot of basswood around here, which is a real kind of a rich site indicator. I'm seeing lots of Christmas fern in here, even some maidenhair fern in here as well that give you a sense this is an enriched site. Sugar maple grows in a lot of soil types, but it does the best when the pHs are circumneutral. So I think the Rickers had a great thing going here. Well, this is our last stop, and it's a great one because it's really emblematic of this integration of natural history and cultural history, because of course sugaring brings together the physiology of the sugar maple and the needs and ingenuity of the humans, beginning with, of course, the native peoples that really discovered this relationship. And phenologically, it's a perfect time to study the physiology of the sugar maple in March and what's happening with the sap production. So today we'll end here as a great manifestation of the farmscape as a social ecological system and this interrelationship between humans in Vermont and this amazing landscape.